Welcome to the Equipping Leaders Podcast Leader Study Series. I'm Natasha, a leader development professional and overall leadership enthusiast.
I'm Corey, a program manager and an emerging people leader, thus a leadership enthusiast.
We are doing a leader study of the TV show Z Nation, deconstructing the leaders, leadership decisions, and team dynamics of the characters on the show to look at how leadership is all around us. And even if we're not in a position of leadership, we can still demonstrate it in our actions, responses, and in the opportunities around us.
Z Nation aired from 2014 to 2018, but if you haven't seen it yet, there will be spoilers in these episodes. In this episode, we're talking about Season 2, Episode 11, Corporate Retreat. Let's jump in.
Okay, so now the group gets to meet another interesting group of folks. We're in Season 2, Episode 11, Corporate Retreat. And in this opening scene, there's this big firefight. There's a lot of smoke, just kind of a lack of oxygen in the air. And what's really interesting is they are all equally fighting and all equally protecting each other. So I think that's really interesting. Like there's a very cool scene where a zombie is coming up behind Warren, and before she even tracks it, Vasquez destroys that zombie, right? So we start off with just showing how well they work together as a team. But what were some of the initial takeaways from the start of this episode for you?
I agree. I thought that the opening was really cool, just because, like you said, like the fire, the smoke, everyone was like trying to shout out, like because communication is key, right? And so that like they were all trying to communicate, and it was a definite struggle. Don't worry, that's just my cat. She has issues. Yeah, so they were all trying to communicate, and I thought that was, now this is more in regards to the episode than I guess it is leadership, but I thought that was also really cool foreshadowing, like when they were talking about the importance of communication and like what comes next. So I really enjoyed that aspect of it. But like you said, they had each other's backs. I think Addie like shouted out, like she just mercied a zombie and was like shouting out for Warren, trying to find her. And they just wanted to regroup, right? And I thought that was really neat.
And then they approach this hotel, and there are folks inside who are hiding like just out of sight. And the inside folks, we can hear them, they're having this quiet argument about whether or not to let them in. And so this is the start of a lot of very annoying, for lack of a better word, phrases that are often used in corporate retreat type places. But the first thing they're saying is that we haven't considered all the negative outcomes, which is just, it's just very interesting that, you know, there's this feeling, and oftentimes this feeling, because it's true, that things happen so slowly. And yes, there needs to be planning and like risk assessment. But I think like statements like that are like, you can't know everything. So there's that. And with that, Iggy, a member of the group, decides to let Warren's team in. And even though in those first moments, the rest of that team voted no, everybody else inside that building said, no, don't let them in. Iggy overtook, he said, we can't leave them out there. We haven't seen visitors in over a year. So this is kind of our initial, you know, entry into this group and then why they let Warren and her group in. So what are some of your thoughts?
Do I have the talking stick now? So I loved everything about this episode, because I think from what our like goals of this podcast are, right? Like looking at this through a leadership lens, and arguably mainly from like, well, at least me, I can't speak for you, but I'm looking at this very much through like the lens of leadership that I see most often, which is in a business kind of corporate environment. Like everything in here is like that just turns everyone off to leadership in the organizations that I work within, right? This whole idea of the talking stick, of having this like coach essentially, I wouldn't even, it's an insult to coaches everywhere, like motivational grifter speaker, like, right, speaker come in and like this talking stick thing, and let's form these like trust circles and everything else. It's just like I love everything about it because it also runs. I don't think that's. I think that might work for some people. I've never really seen any teams where that's worked like super effectively, and I think you have the Operation Bite Mark team that is working really effectively come in and see this, and they really quickly start to poke holes, like not even intentionally, in sort of like how ridiculous a lot of it is. And that's like my favorite thing about it. You know what I mean? And that maybe that's just like the pessimist in me, right? Or like the anarchist in me, but it's like everything that I do not stand for is being destroyed in this episode, and I love it.
I completely agree that a lot of the thing, it's interesting because I work in leader development, right? So there's a lot of pieces of like, how do we train people to be psychologically safe? Spoiler alert, we don't use talking sticks. Right? So, and if anyone doesn't know, like, yeah, a talking stick is essentially this process of in a group so that everybody can be heard fully. If you have the talking stick, you can talk. And if you don't, then you can't. And so what I like what you said too about, and we'll start to break down the different components within the episode, but that piece of in an environment where there's no conflict, where there is no stress, where there's no need for psychological safety, and where there are no deliverables, this stuff's going to work. But you meet this kind of stuff with reality, and all of a sudden it's like, these are all just empty words, and this is all just theory. And what you actually need is, are there components of letting people be heard that's super important? Of course. But like, even if we go back to the episode where Murphy was kidnapped by the three folks who wanted to take him to the pharmacy, Doc's asking all these questions. He has all these things he needs to say, and Warren stops him. Doc, too many questions, right? Because we don't always need all these voices. We don't always need to hear everyone all the time. Eric Pilner did this really great work around when you're in a group with someone who has a vote, who has a voice, who has a veto, and who has a view, and to be very clear about what is needed and when from who. And that's really that piece of, and that changes with the situation, with the different dynamics of the team as people leave or come into the team. But then it's not just like, oh yeah, everyone here is on equal ground, because we're not. Right. And sometimes people who can make a decision need to be the ones to make the decision, or who can have a hard conversation need to do that. So I agree that there's a lot of things in here that I was just like, ugh, just rolling my eyes. Just, this is nightmarish. But when we have their, pardon me, when we have their initial meeting, super aggressive. Everyone is pointing weapons at each other. And then the corporate retreat facilitator, as I'm calling him, Gideon Gould, says that they don't have a leader, even though he speaks up, takes kind of control of the situation. Again, kind of a very funny thing. He says we don't have a leader. Everyone here participates in our decision making. Which, what are your thoughts about like this situation? Yes, but what are your thoughts about that phrase? Everyone here participates in our decision making.
I believe I've said it here before. I've run into this a lot. That's that whole, in my opinion, right? That's where you run into that like paralysis by analysis piece, right? Because rarely are you ever going to get it to where everyone agrees on what the next course of action should be. I think it's easy for the big stuff. In this case, let's not get bit by zombies. Everybody's going to agree to that. And I think you can get lulled in this false sense of like, everyone like being on the same page when they're not, right? Because that's such a generic, like, yes, it's sort of like everyone thinks you should probably eat food and sleep, and like you know what I mean? Like those aren't points to come to an agreement on, because everyone's already in agreement with them. It's no brainer things. So I think the other problem with that is I don't know, you're gonna hate me for saying this, but like you need people who understand like their role is to like get the job done, and you need people to understand like their role is to decide on what the job is going to be. Because if everyone thinks that because It's not easier. It's different, right? Making a decision is much different than operating on or performing a decision. And I think most cases, most people, especially if you're going to like a corporate leadership retreat, probably fall within the category of someone who either A, already is a decision maker, or B, is trying to become a decision maker. You're not going to have a lot of people that are there to like, because they're focused to get the job done, right? And I like to just say, like, for the sake of simplicity, like a developer, right? There's probably not a lot of developers there. There's probably a lot of people that are trying to lead developers now. You know what I mean? So it's like, I saw it like that. You can never say like we all are contributing in this, because you have to have some delineation of role understanding. Because if you're bouncing between making decisions and like operating on those decisions, there's always going to be conflict. Like that's how I see it.
I don't hate you. And I do in fact agree, because there are a lot. I mean, you said it really well. Like, not everybody is the decision maker. And when you are letting too many voices in the room, suddenly it becomes like the peanut gallery, and it needs to be your decision, right? Because you are accountable for that decision and you can't blame anybody else for it. So while you can have, and I've said it before, perspective as an input, I don't necessarily need it when it comes time to make a decision. As a leader, I've been getting this the whole time in my one-on-ones with people, understanding what they do, what their challenges are, so that then when a decision needs to be made, I am the decision maker. So I do agree in that way, because not everybody can be, and not everybody is equipped to be, in all honesty. And whether that's something, skills that they need to develop, emotional intelligence that they need to have, like there are a lot of different things that come with that. So I think also the delineation you made there between people who execute on a decision and people who make a decision, when I think about that too, it's like, I don't remember who it was a thought leader who said, if my job is to work on this $500 thing, right? Like that's my project, then I know how to solve a $500 problem. Maybe I can go up and I can solve a more expensive problem. But then I have leaders who they're probably overseeing my $500 project and a bunch of others. So their budget is, $10,000. I'm using low numbers, but so they're solving a $10,000 problem, and that's what they're looking at. So essentially, if you're a decision maker, what we want to do as individual contributors and as good followers is to get you away from that decimal as much as possible. You need to be looking at and solving the $10 million problem, and not focused on a $500 thing. Let me do that, right? Like that's my lane, that's my job, and I can do that well. So I think that, there is that delineation, but also that piece of, I am also always gathering information because I'm the leader and I need to know this information. But I definitely agree.
Yeah, so one of the other things that I think is interesting, what do we call him? Communication facilitator?
His name was Gideon, so we can just call him that.
Oh, okay. I thought we were quipping. I thought we were doing something there. Okay, my bad. Misunderstanding. Gideon, or Gulliver, right? Whatever, you pick a name. Gideon, I also think that was really interesting was he bought and we all make decisions together, right? But I think like one, visually, him holding the talking stick when everybody walked in, right? That was, to me, hearkened to like this shepherd staff, to like this if you say the only person that can talk is the person holding the stick, and in the initiation of the conversation, you are the one with the stick originally, to me, that looks like that is the representation of the power of talking, and you are now voluntarily relinquishing that to someone, but the stick always ends up back with him, right? Mm-hmm. Most of what we see is him holding that stick, so it's maybe the stick is what gives you the ability to talk, but it's him, in my opinion, it's like him like giving people, like, it's a gift he's bestowing upon you for a moment. So like that part to me was very interesting. And then the other thing I think of is like he's controlling the narrative, he's controlling the rules, right? Every single exercise, that, whether it's his, whatever he says, peaceful conflict avoidance, which we can circle back to that later, but like the talking stick game, right? When they break out into the thought groups, when they do all of those sort of things, it is his idea. He is setting the rules, he's establishing the groups. So like he maintains dominance by also, it's as if they were playing Monopoly for the first time, and he's the one reading the rule book, right? He gets to decide when and where those rules get divvied out, and if one doesn't look good for him, he can change that. So like, I thought that that was a really interesting, like, this like, it's a very tight control that he's doing in like this sort of like perceivingly innocent or passive way, right? Like this is for everyone's benefit when really it's kind of for his, you know?
Agreed, because he's the first one to talk when he says, everyone here participates in our decision making. He's the first one to go down the stairs. He's talking to Warren. Warren specifically verbalizes the needs of their group. We need to stay here until the smoke has passed, right? Like that's what we, again, she's very clear in what they need. And then he turns around and tells everyone it's okay to lower their weapons. So you're absolutely right. It's like all the things he's doing. It's almost like this talking stick is this manifestation of this BS piece of, you can have power too. Like we're in this together. And then he goes on to, he does this little, I called it a BS Psych 101 analysis of each member of the team. You're angry. You're this. You're the leader. And I was like, it was just so Psych 101. And he called it filling the pool of shared meaning. My eyes almost got stuck in my skull from rolling it so hard. Because I've definitely seen people who are good at just reading behaviors, right? Which is a great skill, but then to act like now we have this shit, it's something you interpreted is another thing, right? So maybe if like just with behavior, typically where someone's hips are facing is where they want to be. So if they're not facing the person they're talking to, they might not want to talk to that person. That's one interpretation. And there are so many, right? Like there are so many ways. Every person is so different, every situation, every grouping. So that's why with that, it was like, it was so surface level, but he acted like it was so deep. And yeah. And then again, he takes in that leadership role of who are your stakeholders? And then he picks himself and then he picks the other person, Dana. And then, you know, Warren picks herself and Addie. So yeah, there's a lot of obviously the actions don't match the words at all.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, these hips don't lie, first of all. And then secondly, I wonder, and I could be reading too much into this, right? But we're talking about not these hips lying. That's full stop truth. But when we talk about when he decides who the stakeholders are, and the camera pans to the rest of the group, and you can see that there's like a a disagreement, a misunderstanding. They didn't like that decision, right? There was confusion from that. I think one, like a good leader would stop everything and be like, right, that was very clear, overt body language, like that this was not a decision agreed upon. And I think it's a decision also that would potentially warrant like, let's take a pause. What's wrong, right? Where are your hesitations on this? So I think that was one thing that he didn't do. But I also feel like there's a certain level of like psychological control where he's like consistently through, because he's controlling the narrative of what the games are, of what the operations are. He's in a pseudo leadership slash like instructor, trainer, subject matter expert, which is like my least favorite title you can give anyone. I think it's the most damaging, but that's, you know, the personal beliefs of Corey. That he's cornered them into like this, like constantly being gaslit about if whatever their answer is doesn't control, he does not give praise. And he knows all of the jargon and the babble and well, your hips were pointing towards the east, so you know that means you really don't think that now he's destroyed all psychological safety. He's destroyed their ability to think critically, and that's where it's like this super toxic control that he has now because he's always set those rules. And that's like, that to me was like, because I've not to that extreme, but seen similar circumstances in the past, right? So that was the one that's just like struck home, right? It was like my Vietnam.
So I think, pardon me, great point there with the how he's gaslighting the people of that group, right? And obviously there is no real trust, right? He's making decisions, even though he said everybody was a decision maker, didn't ask people for those decisions. But one way to gaslight people is to then, like you use all these words that it's like, I don't even know how to argue with that, not because I'm not smart enough, but because you believe your BS so hard. And the only rationale is that you're crazy. Like that, and that's, then it feels counterproductive. But you're right, it is gaslighting at its finest.
He's portrayed that he's, not to belabor the point, but I've worked in organizations in the past where, like, we'll call it like a management style, right? That was based off of other things, be it agile or whatever, right? That system, that framework, that was custom built by individuals to fit within the organization. That and when you like put on labels like it's based off of something else, right? Like we can just say like SAFe, like scaled agile framework or something, or Scrum. Just pick one of those. It's based off of that, but it's tailored to this organization, right? So certain things are more prescriptive or run counter to what that system normally looks like. And you have people then, they were the ones who literally wrote the rules. So when you try to approach it to understand it, if you run counter, you're running counter to the framework, you're running counter to the culture and to the organization, and you're no longer that like you're not playing with the team. You know what I mean? And so like that's the thing where with all these games, with the structure that he's himself put into place, he controls all of it. So when they get to when there's issues that arise, he had all the control with Ziggy, I think it was, right? To vote him essentially out and say goodbye, enjoy Zombieland, right? Because you're running counter to this culture that we created, when he did nothing, right? He voiced a concern, he raised an issue, and like that whole thing to me was just like mind blowing. Been there, done that, never going back.
Yeah. The when Murphy gets shot and
oh yeah, that's a key plot point. Sorry. Yep. Go ahead.
Well, but he gets banished because they think that he's stealing food, and their rationale is that he's the only other person with access to the food locker. What I also thought was interesting was while everyone is arguing, and when I say arguing, I mean passing the talking stick and getting nowhere, Vasquez does not engage with that at all. He goes and finds evidence, right? So he finds evidence and comes back with the food stash, right? He doesn't know whose it is. He just knows it's someone's. And he's just trying to be like he's looking for the facts and the reason, like what happened. Like, I just need attribution here, right? That's more what he was looking for. And so I thought that was really interesting too, because I think that's the other piece of when some people are like, oh, well, we all went to this corporate retreat or we did this thing. And it's like, oh, these things don't seem to stick. Well, first off, they won't, because outside of that environment, it's not going to work as well, right? Even if you all have this shared pool of meaning or whatever, it's just, that's just not how the human brain works. You don't go to a retreat. It takes about 4 weeks to forget things you learned at a retreat. So, pardon me, there's also that. There's also a piece of some people, great, we can talk about it, and that's fine. To what end? Where is the evidence? What are the stats? What is the data, right? So it's just like also that different personality type, or that different preference of how you take in information and rationalize things for yourself. And I think that Vasquez was a good example of that.
Yeah, I also think what's like interesting, running, they're going through all this, right? So Murphy was shot, then God, I can't remember his name, the man behind Murphy that was also that's shot by the same bullet.
Mm-hmm.
But so you have this mystery, this new problem, right? That's rose. There's conflict within this team. There's these issues, but now Murphy's been shot. That's a big issue for this team, right? And for the Operation Bite Mark team, they also now have an individual who's been shot, and I think what's really interesting is you have that transference of Murphy's like magic blood into this other guy, right? So he didn't like necessarily die all the way, right? He's like somewhere between zombie and human, and I think that also now when we look at like Vasquez and we look at like the issues with the team about like who's right what value does Murphy have, that whole thing, that like that's magic, right? He like essentially brought someone back from the dead, so to speak, in a way. And so like I think that now puts a new emphasis of importance on Murphy and on their core mission too. So like I thought that was a really interesting exchange.
I think also I still love the storming that occurs between Vasquez and Murphy. So they're like walking up these stairs. Murphy sets his coat down on the couch as if he's going to sit on the couch. And Vasquez is very actively looking to go sit on the other part of the couch. And Murphy lays down. So his whole body's covering the couch. Vasquez can't sit there, right? And Vasquez is just like, rolling his eyes like this guy. But I think it's just interesting how these two are just, it's just in them that they've decided that they're not going to get along. So they're in this consistent storming phase. But I wanted to call that out too, because it's like they can storm and still move forward as a group, right? It's the storming between these two people that's not hurting the rest of the team, but that is in fact still occurring, right? They're still definitely not getting along.
Interesting that you, as a Murphy sympathizer, would see that action as a funny haha, where I, as just a normal human being, would see that as like a slight toxic masculinity trait, but it's fine. It's fine. We'll move on. It's cool.
We'll move on then. So speaking of toxic masculinity, so back to Gideon. He also says something, and it goes back to your point of him gaslighting people, where he says they're going to find the killer by using the talking stick plus deductive reasoning. And whose deductive reasoning is that? It's his.
Yep.
It's so, and then, when he decides it's Iggy insists it's not him, but he then banishes Iggy. Like you said, he didn't follow the rules that this person made up. And neither side has been proved or disproved, but he just decides to do that. So Iggy's out there. So now we're at another point, still a ton of friction in between the corporate retreat team constantly going on, and then between the corporate retreat team and Warren's team. And so finally they get to a point where they're trying to figure it out still. And Dana, who was one of the stakeholders with Gideon, she finally stands against Gideon when they find out that she is one of the people who wanted to leave. And so I think this kind of goes back to earlier when you said, we can all agree that we don't want to be killed by zombies, right? But I think also this goes to like, but maybe some people would like, what is worse for them? Because she says, I'd rather take my chances out there than die in here listening to you. And so for some people, they're like, I would rather not sleep, or I would rather not eat. I mean, we're like using really basic things, but to also think that like, oh, everybody would be on board with this. Maybe somebody wouldn't, and they have their own reasons why. So, and again, Gideon kind of does the same thing he did with Iggy, where he's just like, you go, like, you're no value here, right? So it's like, it messed with this structure that he had in place. So therefore, I'm going to make you seem crazy and irrational, like you need me.
Yeah, nope, exactly. It's it's a really crazy sort of timeline too, because this is all happening like really quickly as well. Like, and these are major changes that are being made to the team's dynamics, right? So like they're removing people from their group at in a very short like course of time as well. And so like I also think it's interesting that you're not really getting, he's controlling the team by not allowing them the time to like think things through, right? It's like it's a now or never, right? It makes me think of like when you get an offer letter from an organization, right? It's like you have 72 hours to respond back to this, or the offer is no longer valid, right? It's like, well, I need to look and see, right? Does this healthcare, does it fit my family's needs or whatever? So I think like that's also a really kind of like overtly, covertly control mechanism that he's put into place as well, right? Like you could have locked him up for a second and thought this through and given him like a fair trial, so to speak. But that rushing of it doesn't allow people to think or process.
That's such a great point. And then they get to a point where Gideon tries to kick Warren's team out, and she's like, no, we're staying here till my man is well enough to travel. Like, it just, the answer is no. It's like, and it wasn't, and I think having seen how he operated in other things, she also saw that just standing her ground was going to work.
I was about to say that because he almost like backpedals then, and in a like a half-butted attempt to make it like to make it seem like it was his idea that they should stay until the guy's well enough. You know what I mean? Like, so like again, I think Warren realized very quickly that you push back even the slightest. He spent however many years from the zombie apocalypse not dealing with anyone really pushing back against him, that he's almost lost the skill to negotiate or be like a true leader and stand by like values or mission or whatever, right? He can no longer do that.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's that, it's such a great point because it brings up the other piece where it's like, we can learn all these communication techniques. We can do all these different things. And we should, as leaders, we should always be educating ourselves, trying to reskill and upskill and all of that. And at the end of the day, that is one tool in our toolbox. And sometimes I have seen leaders who get so caught up in like trying to be a great communicator, trying to make sure they understand and this understands and this and this. And it's like, and you've spent all that time and this person has gone nowhere, right? Like it's gone nowhere. And maybe that's your approach, but also maybe it's them. So at the end of the day, though, there are still results that we need to get. There is still something that has to be delivered, and not delivering that is not an option because then you're not keeping up your end of the transaction or the contract with your job. So I think also sometimes when you get into stuff like this, and Gideon falls into this very easily, where it's like, you're so like your mind is so mired in like, this is how you communicate, and this is this, and this talking stick, and this popcorn process, and deductive reasoning, and shared pool of meaning. And it's like all things that are valuable, not something that's going to be built in a day or even a week, right? Things that are part of a culture and built over time, but also it's not going to work in every situation. And you getting stuck in that is making everybody stuck.
Yeah. I wish I was smart enough to have something else to contribute to that, but it's like a very true point. I got nothing.
Well, I love your contribution.
Yeah.
So,
well, yeah, no, yeah. So, but then, the other thing too, though, as we move forward to this episode, and there's still like, lest we forget, Murphy's been shot. One of their team members been shot. They still don't know like who the shooter was. All they know is about the stealing food thing. And something we didn't mention earlier, but when they like had Iggy, when they had Iggy on trial, so to speak, right? One of the things he was talking about was like they all thought it was him because he had stole food in the past, but he's like, hey, I like paid my punishment for that crime, so to speak. He's been on, I think, less calories and doing the kitchen duty and some of the crummier jobs since then. And I also thought that was like, I think in a good organization, you can make a mistake, pay for that crime, for lack of a better term, and then move on, right? Like you're gonna have to rebuild trust and everything like that for sure. But like, there's also something to be said of like, you tried something, you messed up or whatever. I'm thinking of retribution is the only word that's coming to mind, right? But like, you've paid back that debt, you've learned from that mistake, we're going to move on with it. And it was like, nope, they weren't, right? They were holding on their back pocket. It become very toxic from the perspective of like, well, so and so said this or did that. So it's almost like gossip, or that, nobody can ever live something down, nobody can ever let anything go, because it's just such a like walking on eggshells environment.
That's a great point, because yeah, when people can be accountable for their actions, there are consequences for things that we do. And if we can accept those consequences, or when we do accept those consequences and move forward with that, people won't grow if we don't let them, right? If we're always like pointing back to like, oh, there's this point. The other thing too, that's really interesting here is that oftentimes when there is a point that a leader, or not a leader at all, sorry, but someone is trying to make a point and trying to diminish the character of someone else, they will select a moment in time when that person was at their weakest, when they had the most power over them. And that is who that person is forever. And that is the version that they will bring up time and time again. So even though that person has evolved way past that, they will still point to that because it's all they have. It's all the control that they have. And it's a terrible thing that people do. And many people do it like subconsciously, but that's just it. You're pointing to a time when this person was at their weakest, when they made this big mistake or whatever, and they have evolved past that. And so I've talked to people who are like, oh, these people won't let me move past this. And I always tell them, like, when somebody brings up your past, just say, oh, thank goodness I'm not that person anymore, right? Thank goodness I've evolved past that. Maybe you get over it now, right? Like that type of thing. But it's like, people grow, but we don't, like, oftentimes people won't let them, or then they'll get stuck like, oh, well, they're always going to hold this against me. Then you don't hold it against you, right? Like, and I know that's coming from a privileged place to be able to say something like that. But at the same time, it's like, you've grown, you're different, you stand in that and understand that where they're coming from is trying to get control in this situation, and they don't have control of you right now. So they're going to find a time when they did.
Yeah. That's such a great point too, about the, keeping you trapped in that situation, or in that past, right? And not letting you have grown or evolved. And I think, it's funny. I think that also hits home for me too, because there's been a lot of, I'm still relatively younger, right? Getting a little older. I have the forehead to show it. But like, what I think, when you've been at an organization for a really long time, right? And when you've evolved in that organization, I think sometimes it's difficult to grow outside of how they first met you, right? Or like, that's really interesting. That's a really interesting point as well that you bring up. So yeah.
So then they hear a knock. Turns out Iggy is alive.
Yeah.
Survived. He comes back in, and Gideon says something that, once again, I roll so my eyeballs, like my retina's detached. But he says, I had to write it down because it was so ridiculous. He says, Ignatius, you have every right to be angry. The process failed you. On behalf of everyone, we're sorry. You have a lot of complicated feelings right now, but we need to work through those feelings. And I wish I hadn't heard people say some of these exact things.
I was just thinking, if I had $1 for every time I've heard you say those things.
Well, Corey, I'm sorry that the process fails you so much. Okay. Yeah, but I think that's so, it's like, that's obviously, we know it's a deflection. It is like as if this had nothing to do with me. And it's the system. Now, I created the system, but it's the system and it's not me. So what were your thoughts about that part?
Agreed, but like everything you said, yes, absolutely. He had that in the chamber, right? Like, so to speak, like he dumped out those words instantly from a situation that unless he was a psychopath, pathological liar, manipulator, that's the only time you're going to think, in my opinion, right? Also not a psychologist, not an ologist in anything really, but he's done this so much now. He has created a system for which he's in such control of that now it's reached a point of like this stability that he can essentially war game through every hole that somebody might be able to poke in this, right? Because it's about as thin as tissue paper, this whole structure. And he is already loaded up with the response back to like what you would think is like, oh, he's just defusing a tense situation. No, he's putting scotch tape on his paper system. So like that was my biggest takeaway, is that that whole phrase that he spat out almost instantly, boy, he already had it in the chamber.
And I think so through all of this, he's like, nobody's the leader. We all make decisions together. We have this talking stick, this popcorn process. And I think Iggy was a really great.
I forgot about the popcorn process.
Yeah, the popcorn process, the pool of shared meaning, all this nonsense. And so at the end, Iggy grabs that walking stick, or he takes that walking stick and he essentially kills Gideon with it by hitting him over the head. But he says something really impactful there, where it was like through this whole thing, he's trying to teach them how to communicate, how to talk to each other. We're all talking, we're all decision makers, blah, blah. But Iggy says, for all the people who aren't here to speak for themselves, because you did all the speaking for them. And I think it's just like, it also kind of circles back to people know when it's bullshit. And sometimes people, oh, can I say that? I have to put explicit on this, but people know when it's BS, because sometimes there's the piece of like, I don't fully understand this. Maybe I'm not as into like the theory of things as much, right? And so there's a difference between misunderstanding and being like, this is wrong, right? Like what you're doing is wrong. And I think in that statement, Iggy really identified what exactly was wrong with all the things that Gideon was doing.
Yeah, since we're already gonna have to put the adults only on this one, Gideon was a real poo-poo head. And you referencing the popcorn thing, I'd forgotten, and I wanted to talk about it earlier. So I'm gonna do a callback real quick. I apologize. When we're talking about that control and everything else, I do not believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, he did not recommend the popcorn exercise. I think he was like, I think he said, group, what do we think we should do? And I think someone else recommended what about the popcorn exercise? And he heavy praise against her, right? So again, that pseudo I'm in control sort of situation, but because it was within his narrative flow that he got that praise. If somebody would have said something counter to his narrative flow, he would have done the redirect and everything else. So yeah, sorry, I know kind of late in the game there for that callback, but that was something I remember.
No, that's a great point. Where essentially when they're like, oh, what should we do? The three options you have are, right? Yes. Like without saying the three options you have are. So no, that's a good point.
Yeah. But this was by far one of my favorite episodes of the entirety of the show. I really, just because, like I said, it pokes fun at so many things that I see people like really, and there's something wrong with buying into something too, and like you had said earlier, the talking stick is like a super useful exercise, especially if you're a third grader. But like, it's just, I don't know. It was very interesting to me. Like the I Care cat, right? Like we've talked about time and time again for me, is like, these are such, like you said, blue sky, perfect world. Like, yeah, this is all going to work out great. But in the true thick of it, of like a corporate environment, in a business that's designed to make money or create a product or provide a service, and it's all like, that whole is the driving factor. A lot of these things don't always like play out as great as he explains them. So I think that's like my favorite part.
Yes. And yeah, like we've said, it's, you want to try out new things, try new skills, see what works for the team and the situation. Also just add to your toolbox. But yeah, I know I used to work with someone who we could all tell which TED Talk he just watched by what like the ideas that he had that day at work. And it would change. So that was the other thing, was there was no consistency with it. So it was like every few days we're like, oh boy, okay, we know this one. So we were ready for it. But again, good ideas. A complete overhaul implementation is not always the approach. So yeah, I agree though. It was a really fun episode to watch. Also, like I said, I am a leader development facilitator. So to see things where you're like, yeah, that's not how that's done. Yes, it's the zombie apocalypse, but yeah, it's not how it's done.